Great to be able to welcome Alice Sullivan here today. Alice is a professor of sociology at UCL, and she's now head of research in the UCL Social Research Institute, which you may not have heard of, but it's the agglomeration of pretty much all the social science bits that used to be in IOE, including the cohort studies. In fact, mentioning cohort studies, Alice has been important in those. She was running the PCS 70 for a decade, was given up to take on the wider research job. She works mainly on social and educational inequalities in the life course, mentioned the cohorts, right? And more recently on conflicts between scholarly and scientific values and gender identity politics. If you look at her website, you find that her current projects are reading for pleasure, well, I'd sign up for that one, schooling and unequal outcomes, and a topic related to today, which is sex, gender, and gender identity. So the topic is there. Why do we need data on sex? Great. So there is Alice sent a copy of the paper. It's available. I can forward to people afterwards. If you email me, I can send it. Usual rules apply. Speaker speaks for about 45, 50 minutes, then we have Q&A and so on. Thanks, Alice.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And it's lovely to be here and I'm honoured to speak to this group. So, why do we need data on sex? Seems like kind of probably quite an obvious question. And for this audience, you might think, well, why do we even need to talk about this? So I'm going to talk about why sex matters briefly, but then I'm going to talk about how we're losing data on sex. What are the arguments against collecting data on sex, and where have those arguments come from, and do they hold water? How did we get here? So, given that the arguments, as I've argued, in favour of collecting data on sex are quite straightforward. How did we get to a point where surveys and administrative data collection and so on are forgotten sex? And then I will sum up. So, sex matters in data collection and analysis. It's a fundamental demographic and explanatory variable. It's a powerful predictor of almost every dimension of social life and health. And those of us who run quantitative analyses, it's a variable that we would never leave out. It's also, in terms of equalities monitoring, it's a protected characteristic in UK law. And public bodies like universities, for example, have a public sector equality duty to actually collect data on protected characteristics, including sex. So I could stand here all day and give you examples of areas where sex matters. I'm just going to give a couple of examples. So this is the sex ratio at birth in different countries. And you can see that, particularly in certain countries like China and India, there are more live births of boys than girls. And we know that hasn't always been the case. It started to happen in the 1980s because the technology became available to have sex-selective abortion. And so in countries where a boy child is more highly valued than a girl, then you start to see sex-selective abortion against girls. And that's possible because sex is determined at conception and very often observed during pregnancy. So it's very good that we have the data, that we can see that there are more boys being born than girls. It seems quite important that we know that. And you might think that's a really uncontentious thing to say, but there's a big ESRC funded research project down the road at King's called The Future of Legal Gender, which argues against this and says sex should not be documented at birth. We all know there are some areas of life where sex differences are quite small and others where they're really big. Violent crime in particular is an area where you see huge sex ratios. So this is just taking data from a particular year in England and Wales, but you could take data from any country at any time and you would see that males are far more likely than females to commit violent crimes. So the vast majority of convicted murderers are male. The vast majority of sexual offences perpetrators are male. Men are actually also more likely to be murder victims, but women are much more likely to be victims of sex offences. So you can see when you've got these really dramatic sex ratios, just a little bit of data out, even just a few males being classified will make a very big difference in terms of the level of error and confusion in the data. And yet we're losing data on sex, we're losing it across a whole range of administrative data collection exercises, and also social surveys, medical and clinical data collection, and equalities monitoring. So if we start with crime, which we've just talked about, police forces are quite inconsistent in their practice. But many police forces are now recording crimes by men as though they were committed by women if the perpetrator requests that. So, and that, as I'll go on to show, that's particularly problematic given the nature of crime data and the very big sex gaps. Gender pay gaps, so the Government Equalities Office advises that data should be categorized by gender identity, not sex. So I will argue throughout that it would be great to have data on both gender identity and sex, but they also argue that instruct companies to exclude non-binary people from the gender pay gap data. Now, that seems a bit strange, given that if you're a female and you identify as non-binary, you might still be discriminated against as a woman. Your boss might still see you as a person who might potentially become pregnant, for example. So it's a big assumption to say that someone's identity will necessarily trump their sex, and we would need data in order to show that. In health, in the NHS, you can replace your sex marker with your gender identity just at request again. So it's just a request thing. That has implications, of course, for the research that we do with admin data. Also has really serious implications for those individuals who will be missed for screenings that they may need according to their natal sex. And then the most recent one I've heard about, UCAS is apparently proposing to move away from a binary sex question. So we will no longer, if that goes through, we will no longer have reliable data on the sex of undergraduates according to what subject they're doing and all of those things that many of us are interested in studying. And that will be will have particular implications given that age group, and I'll go on and talk about that. So I first got involved in this because I became aware that there was a proposal to change the guidance for the 2021 census in England and Wales. So the question remained the same, but the guidance was saying you should answer the sex question according to your gender identity, not your sex. And that was despite the fact there was also a new voluntary question, which was very much welcomed, on gender identity. So why not just have an accurate sex question and gender identity question as well? That ended up in court, and the outcome was that the guidance is not about identity, it's about your legal sex. But the Scottish census, which became separated from the England and Wales census by a year because of COVID and because of the decisions that they made, that also went to court, and the decision went the other way. So sex has become a devolved matter. So this is not very good for data harmonization if sex means one thing in Scotland and something else in the rest of the UK. And that's also reflected in different guidance that we see in different jurisdictions. So Scotland's chief statistician has made a very strong recommendation that sex should only be recorded in a small number of instances on an individual basis for a very specific purpose on a case-by-case basis. So basically, you should hardly ever collect data on sex. And in contrast, we've got very good guidance from the UK Stats Authority recommending that sex, age, and ethnic groups should be routinely collected and reported in admin data and in-service process data, including health, police, courts, prisons, and data producers should distinguish between sex, gender, and gender identity. So what are sex, gender, and gender identity? I think it's important to just touch on these decisions because this is where a lot of the confusion comes in. So sex is a biological variable. It's an immutable binary category based on reproductive functions. So humans are just like all the other mammals. We reproduce sexually and there are two sexes and only two sexes. Gender refers to sort of social stereotypes and social roles. I used to use this word gender a lot as basically a synonym for sex. I sort of try not to do that anymore because I think it has become a word that people are increasingly meaning lots of different things. So I sort of try to avoid just using the word gender, and if I want to refer to gender stereotypes or gendered roles, then to be explicit about that. But that sense of gender is based on how other people perceive you and pigeonhole you. And then there's a third concept, which is gender identity, which is psychological, and which is not about how other people see you, but how you see yourself, particularly if that's not congruent with your sex. And those three concepts, I think, are increasingly being muddled. So I'm going to give you a few examples of questions where I think this kind of muddling is occurring. So someone sent me this screenshot recently. This is from a study on COVID, which is being run by Imperial College. And we know that there are sex differences in how people are affected by COVID. You know, women might be more likely to have long COVID and so on. So you would think there must be a sex question. Instead, we get this question: which of the following best describes you? Now, as someone who's involved in designing questionnaires for many, many years, that right away is very strange, because the basics of a good question is that it should say what information you're asking for. This doesn't really say what the question is about, what's the target of the question. And then the first two categories are, you might think, are sexes, male and female, but then we've got non-binary and prefer to self-describe. And so it sort of implies that people who identify as non-binary are not male or female. And a basic questionnaire design principle is that categories should be mutually exclusive unless you can pick more than one. And these categories are not mutually exclusive. So there's no way for somebody who identifies as non-binary to also provide the information that they're female or they're male. Even if they want to provide that information, they can't. Now, this is Public Health England, and it's about LGBT sexual health. And so given it's about sexual health, you would think kind of quite obvious that you might want to know people's sex, because that's quite relevant for their sexual health. But here we have no question on sex. Instead, we have how do you identify your gender, and the categories make clear that males who identify as women should be included with women and vice versa, so that you don't have both pieces of information. You don't have what your sex is and how you identify. It's kind of muddled. And then again, you've got non-binary people excluded from providing any information on their sex, despite the fact that just identifying as non-binary is not going to change the fact your sex has implications for your sexual health. And then we have this: is this the same gender you are assigned at birth? And that's kind of interesting language, which I will come back to. This idea that you are somehow arbitrarily assigned a gender at birth rather than your sex simply being observed. And we know already that sex is determined in conception, and it's typically observed before birth, and that has real implications for people's lives. Now coming to equality monitoring. So this happens to be a Labour Party example, but that's just, you know, you'll see these kinds of questions everywhere, so I'm not singling them out. So equal opportunities monitoring: sex is a protected characteristic, but where's sex? It's nowhere. So what best describes your gender identity? Again, we've got male and female, which look like sexes rather than gender identities. We've got non-binary, we've got other, and there's no option to say that you don't have a gender identity. Then again, you've got this same language: is your gender identity the same as you were assigned at birth, with that implication of arbitrary assignation of sex, as though sex somehow isn't real. And then this final question is also very interesting: do you identify as intersex? Now, intersex is quite dated language for what medics would typically call DSDs, so differences of sexual development. That's not an identity, it's a developmental condition, and it affects something like 0.02% of people. So why are we asking about this incredibly rare set of conditions? It's really intrusive, and there's no way you're ever going to be able to use that data because there's so few people affected by this. Why are they asking this? I'll come back to how this has kind of got into data collection. Okay, so what are the arguments against collecting data on sex, given that this is happening everywhere? I could spend a long time going through an awful lot of arguments. I'm kind of trying to concentrate on the key ones, and the chapter has more on this. But so the first two arguments, the categories are violent and that there are more than two sexes, are kind of the keys to the theory behind this. And then conflating self-reported sex and gender identity is something that we see a lot in policy documents. And the argument that the numbers are too small to matter, I think, is something that, especially people who aren't quantitatively trained, it seems kind of quite plausible. Like, a lot of people will say, oh, of course, I agree with you, Alice, about all of this, but surely it doesn't really matter. It's it's still a small number. But actually, I think there's a number of mistakes in the argument that the numbers are too small to matter. Okay, so where's all the trouble start? It's with Judith Butler, Gender Trouble, 1990. So she argues that the naming of sex is an act of domination and compulsion, an institutionalized performative that both creates and legislates social reality by requiring the discursive, perpetual construction of bodies in accord with principles of sexual difference. So it's kind of a mouthful, but the key thing to pick up on here is the idea that by naming sex and making these categories, we actually literally create sex. So sex doesn't exist until we name it. By measuring it, that's an act of oppression. So quite strange as an argument on a number of levels. As a sociologist, we use lots of categories that really are social constructions. Sex is quite unusual in being genuinely a biological category. When we think of categories like social class and ethnicity, those really are social constructions, but we still measure them because we think it's important, because they still relate to something real in the world. What Judith Butler is trying to argue is that if we stopped naming sex and measuring sex, then oppression according to sex would go away. It's, imagine if you made that argument about poverty. Let's stop measuring poverty because it's naming it and measuring it as a problem. Nobody makes that argument. But for some reason, get this argument when it comes to sex. Next up, we have Fausto Sterling and the 5 sexes. So Fausto Sterling says, Western culture is deeply committed to the idea that there are only 2 sexes. Well, yeah, maybe because there are only 2 sexes, but the claim she's smuggling in there as well is that somehow sex is Western, which is a little bit bizarre because, again, it affects all the mammals and all the humans, regardless of where they live. So there's this idea that somehow it's a colonial imposition that other cultures didn't have sex before we came along and, explained human reproduction to them or something. And then she goes on to say, biologically speaking, there are many gradations running from female to male. One can argue that along that spectrum lie at least 5 sexes, and perhaps even more. So whenever you hear someone say sex is a spectrum or gender is a spectrum, this is ultimately the source of that. Now, Fausto Sterling, alongside Judith Butler and all of the other postmodernist queer theorists, make a big deal out of DSDs, which they don't call DSDs. Fausto Sterling refers to hermaphrodites, and to intersex. And what she's trying to do is queer the binary. So queer theory does not like binary categories. It thinks that binary categories are somehow oppressive. And so by trying to say there are these anomalous cases, you try to undermine the idea that there are these two categories. Now, again, it doesn't make sense in terms of anyone who's ever collected data. We deal with lots of much murkier categories with lots of anomalous cases in something like social class or ethnic group. Doesn't stop us from collecting the data. But it's also, it's an argument that's been constructed with falsehoods. So if you ever hear someone claiming, for example, that intersex is as common as red hair, the ultimate origin of that is people like Pastor Sterling, who originally claimed that 4% of people had intersex conditions. Then she went down to 1.7%. But the real number of people where there's any difficulty in establishing their sex at birth is really, really tiny. So it's more like 0.02. Even if it was 4%, that would not make these people who have a sex, they are not a third sex. They have conditions, a range of conditions, which may mean that that sex isn't obvious when they're born. Doesn't mean they don't have sex. So, and something I think is important to flag about that, not just that it's nonsensical, but these are real people. And so this is a submission from a group called DSD Families to the Scots Parliament in response to the fact that these kinds of arguments rooted in queer theory were being made to the Parliament. It's also important that children's bodies are not politicized and that they have the space to tell their own stories without being used by groups that want to portray those with DSDs as a third sex, whereas neither male nor female. They're not a third sex. To be a third sex would mean literally a third category of people that is necessary for the production of a new human. And there is no such category of people. So those are the sort of origins, the theoretical origins of what we're seeing in policy documents and in questionnaires. But very often the arguments that we see made don't directly refer to those, possibly because the people making these arguments may not even be aware of where these ideas come from. I think it's really important that we, as social scientists, understand the provenance of it. And I think anyone involved in data collection actually needs to know something about this. But we tend to see arguments like this one, which says that there's no difference between reporting your sex and self-identifying your gender identity. So this was in response to a change in the Scottish Household Survey, where they moved away from a sex question to a gender identity question. And they said, oh, it's not really a change because we've never asked people's sex because it was always self-reported, therefore it was always identity. You can look at the two questions and see whether you think there was a change. In 2017, they asked, are you male or female? In 2018, how would you describe your gender identity? They're two different things, and they're both important. We should ask both. So the final argument, which I think is an argument that has a good deal of plausibility, especially for people who are quantitatively trained, it completely makes sense to me that people think this. Surely this is a small group, maybe it just doesn't matter. I think the first mistake that people possibly make here is by, when they hear the word trans, thinking it refers to transsexual people or to people with gender recognition certificates. So trans does not mean transsexual. Obviously, this is a term which has a meaning that's changing over time. So I've taken this from the Stonewall glossary, and they're very clear it's an umbrella term, and it describes a whole range of people, including, but not limited to, transgender, transsexual, genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, cross-dressers, etc., etc., etc. So this is a broad range of people. And so the potential for the numbers of people identifying in these various ways over time to change is quite obvious. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So we're seeing far more young people in the current generation starting to identify in some of those ways, whether as trans, as non-binary, etc., etc. And I'm sure you'll have read about the increase in young girls appearing in gender clinics, whereas in previous generations, transsexual people were usually people born male and usually tended to transition much later. This is becoming a much more common phenomenon among youth, and in this generation, it's much more female. And so if we actually want to understand the experiences of this generation, we need to know their sex as well as their gender identity. It's really important. The idea that, for example, a girl that's identifying as non-binary and a boy that's identifying as non-binary will have exactly the same experiences across all dimensions of life is, you know, you would want evidence for that. And in order to gather evidence on that, you'd need their sex. Now, the increase in numbers over time, I think, is something that it's easy to underestimate. So this is from the American College Health Association. And what you see here is the percentage of female undergraduates identifying as trans. And in 2008, that was genuinely a really small number. And perhaps you could have hand-waved it away and said, well, this isn't really going to affect our data on who's doing physics or engineering or whatever. But by 2021, that's gone up to 5%. That's a huge increase over a relatively small period of time. What will be the figure in 2031? We don't know. It may have gone back down, may have stayed the same, may have gone up. So we need data that's going to be future-proof and that's going to allow us to track trends over time. So the numbers might be bigger than you think, but also small numbers can make a really big difference in data analysis. So particularly when the baseline category is also small. So if you're interested in women in physics or women committing violent crime, then small errors are going to make a huge difference, particularly when you're interested in change over time. And you've got to also think about the fact that you're not just probably, as an analyst, thinking about males and females. You'll be thinking about all sorts of other variables as well. And of course, people who identify as trans aren't going to be randomly distributed through all those other categories. And the direction of error, I think, is unpredictable. It depends on the characteristics of the people classifying as trans. So, for example, if it was the case, and I'm not saying that it is, but it might be the case that gender non-conforming females might be more likely to study STEM subjects, and they might also be more likely to classify as male or as non-binary. That would then make your trends over time look as though progress of women into physics or into STEM at school, when actually you don't know what the real trend is. So any level of data error makes it really difficult to look at trends over time. And we know how dramatic in education in particular these differences can be. So this is the real numbers from the maths department at King's. These are male professors, female professors. So if you're monitoring inequalities, just one person changing the way they identify would make it look like there'd been a real dramatic change. This is data on rape prosecutions for England and Wales, which I got via Freedom of Information request. So this is CPS data. Now, rape in law is a male crime, but with the exception that females can be charged as an accomplice. And if females are charged as an accomplice, it's recorded exactly the same. So you can't pull that out as a separate thing in the data. So what you see here is that from 2007, and I asked about earlier data, I was told it doesn't exist. So something happened in 2007 where they started recording the sex of people prosecuted for rape. Is it that before that they didn't record it because they assumed they were male? I don't know, but I was told there's just nothing before 2007. And then you see it's increasing over time. So what's happened? Is it that police forces are increasingly recording males who are prosecuted for rape as female, or are there more females being prosecuted for rape as an accomplice? We cannot know. There is absolutely no way of answering that question. Now, when I've spoken about this, and I made a submission to, I think it was to the Scottish Parliament, about the importance of accuracy in crime reporting, and the reaction was really horrible, as though I was accusing trans people of being rapists, or, you know, as though it was just a horrible thing to mention. But this, to me, this is exactly the same as needing to know how many female physics professors we actually have. It's simply an area of data which is very, very skewed according to sex, where we need accurate data. So how did we get here? Well, there's been a process of what some people call policy capture. So there's a group called Murray Blackburn Policy Analysis that have done a lot of work on this in Scotland. And they say about these changes in data collection, this change is only happening because of intense lobbying by groups which promote the view that sex should be treated as irrelevant where it contradicts self-declared gender identity. And those groups are groups like Stonewall, for example. And it's the same lobbying that's affected all sorts of different areas of policy. So exactly the same lobbying that's affected sports bodies, for example. No different from the process in the Office for National Statistics. And what that means is that changes in practice have been implemented very quietly, without being announced sometimes, without any scrutiny, and just presented as best practice, which is a term that I've come to find quite fearful. There's been a complete lack of consultation with data experts, so people who know about data collection, and also women's groups. So only a certain type of group has been consulted. And there have been real consequences for anyone who stands up and talks about this, which means that other people look at what's happening, they see, you know, oh, anyone who questions this will be no platform, they'll be targeted for abuse. And so there's a chilling effect. And I know I have lots of colleagues who will say quietly, oh, of course I agree with you on this, but I couldn't possibly say anything in public. And I'm so brave to speaking publicly about this. And so that's, in a way, that's quite a deliberate tactic. You make it so difficult for people to present the arguments that it seems as though there's no argument to be had. And I've experienced that myself. So I was no platformed from a seminar organised by NatSen, which also involved people from the Office for National Statistics. And this was in the run-up to the 2021 census. And it was a one-day sort of workshop on measuring sex and gender and issues around that. So it would have been a great opportunity to talk about these things. And instead they cancelled the event. I got a letter saying, oh, we cancelled the event because there was too much public interest in it. And I thought, hey ho, I think I know what's happened here. And I thought I'd been no platformed, and they'd cancelled it because they did not want to hear me. And I was able to show that. So I did a subject access request, and I got email from the organisation which proves that that was what had happened. And isn't that a shame? Because this ended up in court, and that is not the right place to make decisions about data collection. You know, this is not for judges. It should be for the social research community to talk about these issues and make our decision. When I was collecting signatures from the social science community, objecting to what the Office for National Statistics were at that time proposing to do, a lot of colleagues said, I agree with you, but I'm too frightened to sign. And this was one email that I got, which made me feel really sad, and I'm sharing it with permission, obviously anonymously. So this colleague said, so with a very heavy heart, I've chosen to swallow my integrity on this particular issue and keep my head down. Don't like doing this. I don't like how it feels. Don't like the implications of my inaction for social justice in general, gender issues in particular. So that, I think, is really quite heartbreaking that our social science community would feel that there are areas where they cannot speak up for what they see as true and just because they're too scared for their careers. This was someone on, precarious contract. So, in conclusion, without accurate data on sex, you lose the ability to understand and monitor differences, including for trans people. And I think that's really important. Without data on both sex and gender identity, we can't understand the experiences, the inequalities that people who identify as trans, non-binary, etc., may be facing. We can't design evidence-based policies. We're clearly losing data on sex across a whole wide range of domains. And yet the arguments against using sex as a category just do not hold water. And it's really important, I think, that we as a community understand what those arguments are, where they come from, and just how wrong they are. Policy capture and silencing are still a problem in this area. I think it's getting a little bit better, but people are still scared. And if we value evidence-based policy, we need to stand up against that, whatever our substantive views are. And finally, we shouldn't confuse the concepts of sex and gender identity. We should collect data on both. So I am absolutely in favour of respecting everyone's identities and collecting data. And I have to say, I've concentrated on how data on sex is being garbled. But some of those questions on gender identity, if you treat them as questions on gender identity, they're also garbled. And I think we need to do a much better job of thinking about how we collect data on gender identity, and that thinking just doesn't seem to be being done at all. So finally, thank you so much for having me and for listening. And as Stephen said, this talk is based on a book chapter, which I'm happy to share. And I have a few other publications in this area in case you're interested. And also a website where I've gathered together various other bits and pieces on this topic, if anyone wants more. Okay, thank you very much.